accidentally hit end recording instead of pause recording. So I'm gonna just two separate things for me to look back at. The point is that entire story was to emphasize incentives, economic incentives, and how they matter. They had a quote by, I think it was Adam Smith, one of the founders of modern day economics. It's loading. Adam Smith, in his book The Wealth of Nations, 1776 classic. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regards of their interest. The butcher isn't doing his job to, feed others. The job is to feed others, not he's doing it for. So I'm blabbing. The point is that they're working of their own interest. They get money from their job, their part of the job, and all comes together to feed each person. Pause. And the idea of the quote, along with other things, I did not have to read more, just all that implied, is the fact that everyone works for their own interest in, I forget the exact terminology, but in the specific economies that they're trying to portray. Everyone works in their own interest, and in doing so, they create something that other people would want for a price. So when they eventually, when someone buys it, because it's in their interest to buy it, they get it. The seller gets what they want, the buyer gets what they want. Hence why, for the common interest, it's overall well. That is the idea of the invisible hand idea that is often portrayed in economics. And the text goes on to say that markets, however, do not always align with self-interest with the social interest. Sometimes the invisible hand is absent, not just invisible. Market incentives, for example, can be too strong. A firm that doesn't pay for pollution that emits into the air has too great an incentive to emit pollution. Fishermen sometimes have too strong of incentive to catch fish, thereby driving the stock of fish into collapse. In other cases, market incentives are too weak. Did you get your flu shot this year? The flu shot prevents you from getting the flu, usually, but it also reduces the chance that other people get the flu. There is little incentive besides for the common good for the flu shot. Monetary incentives, more often than not, you can get one for free. So what's the monetary incentive of it? I guess you could say something like, Walgreens, where you can go in and get a free flu shot. The idea behind that is that people come into the store normally, and then they get the flu. Then they go about getting the flu shot, but they might spend more things as well as come back for later things because they realize the good thing. However, when you go to other companies like medical companies, they might actually, for profit in this scenario, not necessarily for morality. Medical companies might actually want you to get the flu, so it might become something they can treat for a profit. Of course, that is, as I've stated before, this is very strictly profit incentives. There are other incentives. The text then goes on to explain parts of the pharmaceutical or the legal drug trade, talking about how, on average, it takes about 12 years and $1 billion to bring a new drug to the market. FDA is very strict on these things because people's lives are at harm. A bad drug can kill you. However, it goes on to talk about drug lag, which is basically saying that since it takes 12 years and $1 billion, it's also true that a new drug is often more effective than an old drug. So a lot of lives may be lost because they didn't have this access to it, this new drug before that 12 years time. So while for scales, people keep building up and building and building up. I'm going a little too fast with that. So death might be piling up, and eventually a new drug gets implemented to market that slows this down. I don't know what I'm doing with this. The point, well, I already said the point. And then it goes about drug loss, talking about how some drugs can't be made because that $1 billion is not something everyone can produce, with investors and with not. And if you really want, because of the fact that less drugs can be produced because the barrier of entry is so high. But if you really want to go conspiracy, you could state that if a drug doesn't have a side effect, you can't have you can't sell a solution. But that's hard to find solid evidence on. After the previous example of pharmaceuticals, it goes about talking about opportunity costs, a relatively generic and mundane idea that exists so incredibly powerfully, but everyone already knows. Still, I'll state it anyways. It goes with the example of college. This is a little old statistics, but it states that the opportunity of college, you might say, oh, it's just the room and board, tuition, books, meals. But in actuality, the opportunity cost is in what you could have gained in that time, or the lives that could have been saved because the drug can't go in as fast, can't go into the market as fast. But in actuality, the opportunity cost would be what you could have earned outside of it. So if 4 years college, if you weren't in college, you might have paid $40,000 a year. 4 years, that's $160,000. So that's pretty high opportunity cost. However, with an educational degree, as long as it's a proper degree, the costs usually depending on the statistics, you could get paid $500,000 more over your entire career. Significantly more than that $160,000. Percentage-wise, still significant, but not as big. In actual, unless you're Elon Musk, that's a large amount of money difference. However, when I stated that room and board and food is opportunity cost, that's actually just not true. Because you would still have to pay for food, you'd still have to pay to live, no matter where you are. I guess you could say that it might be more expensive to board near it, and that could be part of the opportunity cost. Not necessarily opportunity cost, but in calculating how much you could have gained. Because inevitably, you're still spending money for an education, and you could add that. That's sunk. I have the idea of opportunity cost is what you could have gained in the time, and extent you're actually losing some in the short gain. That's what's going off of. And then it actually brings up an interesting thing about recessions and how opportunity cost actually does not decrease during recession. Assuming that the price of tuition, books, room and board doesn't fall during the recession, the opportunity cost of attending college does fall. Because of the fact that, you're not making that $40,000 a year. You might not be making anything at all because so many layoffs. So during that time, you're still getting an education, which could be more valuable after. That value varies because of the recession. Strictly speaking, you're not losing as much because, you might not be in the workforce, or you might get paid less because of the recession. Next segment is called Thinking on the Margin. Pulling straight from the text. Thinking on the margin is just making choices by thinking in terms of marginal benefits and marginal cost. The benefits and cost of a little bit more or a little bit less. Most of our decisions in life involve a little bit more of something or a little bit less. And it turns out that thinking on the margin is also useful for understanding how consumers and producers make decisions. Should the consumer buy more apples or a few less? Should the oil well produce a few more barrels or a few less? Let's think of an example that's not as stated. From a consumer standpoint, okay, I'll go with fans. This is a fan that cost me about $20 at Walmart. there were different options, and depending on this, on how much I was willing to spend, I'm a college student now, so of course frugality is part of it. I could have certainly bought a different one, a greater one that's bigger, more effective, really cools the entire room properly. But since summer only lasts so long, I decided to go with a bit less for these, which I very much enjoy. Not sponsored, obviously, based on my low numbers. But I guess saying that. The next page of the ebook talks about specialization of knowledge. How through groups specializing in specific fields, the collective cumulative knowledge is actually greater because there isn't as much interlap. Of course, you still have to have more people doing the same thing, otherwise there's errors. Point being is that it then goes on to talk about how nations specialize in goods and producing. Specific nations are better at producing one thing than others, say more often not to produce this thing because they can sell it for less. Well, they can sell more of it for less, thereby making every nation succeed. Despite, that might not be their goal, but back with the smaller scale of the butcher, his goal is inevitably for his own incentive. The nation that produces produces more of their good for less of a cost, it's for their incentive. So while they might, point being. But it also talks about how not all, and it goes a little bit more into specialization and opportunity cost. You may be really good at one thing, but if this thing doesn't produce as much as this other thing that you're not as good at, of course, the better you get at this, the less effective. You might be the world's best at one thing, but if you can't make money with it, it's better to actually stick with the thing that you're less good at, but makes you a lot more money, economically speaking. The next page goes off very macroeconomics with wealth. Talks about obvious things. If you're wealthier, your life just increases in more ways than one. You could say that infant mortality goes directly with wealth because better medical capabilities, more prevention, so it doesn't actually happen to begin with. Example being better filtration systems. Of course, wealth also brings women's rights and political liberty. In most cases, there are exceptions, but that is not the rule. Keep in mind this is nation, actually. No, there's nothing more to keep in mind. That just state is that. Simple as that. And then it gives a graph on how the average life satisfaction on a 10-point scale is often higher with GDP per capita converted to dollars at prices. And the more rich you are, the more satisfied you are with life, the higher life expectancy, the higher the quality of life. Basic stuff, but in writing. Or at least implied stuff, not necessarily basic. The next thing up, I'm going to give a little bit of I've only read the first paragraph of the page, but it's talking about if wealth is so important, what makes a country rich? You could state that it's the people, and the more human capital, the more knowledgeable you are, the more effective you can be as workers. But considering it's titled Institutions Matter, it's probably going off of the ability to actually utilize these strengths you have. Think about Singapore. It's lower populations, but it's one of the richest, wealthiest places on earth. While India, very popular, has a really great population, they are really rich, yes, but that wealth isn't spread out as evenly. You could still go about, I'm speaking through stereotypes I've never actually visited, but there are still some places that are relatively poor. But that's to be expected with every location. I get the impression that Singapore is not a complete exception. They go about institutions, how you could speak politically, and how Singapore had one really good dictator that ended up being able to bring their country into one that was so powerful. They're bringing the right things without any of these signs you see in other small countries that are trying to get rich with corruption that's rampant in most governments around the world. It talks about how property rights, political stability, honest government, dependable legal system. There's less incentive to make money if your politician can just, I'm not saying this, if a politician could just take everything away. Because at this point, it's almost like, what's the point of being greater than the status quo? If you could just have your entire brand stolen, and because they have better resources at the moment, they can market it better, all of a sudden you lose the credibility of, you're seen as the copy, unless people are wanting to go to you. It gives an example of North and South Korea. How in the 1950s they were about as equally poor, but through specific regimes and changes, South Korea has a greater per capita GDP. Gross domestic product, which is the total amount your country produces, divided by person, which is the per capita part. So each person is thereby more rich.